Hello, this is Rosalind Salkis. You are watching the New York Times live stream from London, where we're at the British Museum at a wonderful new exhibition that has just opened last week called Rodin and the Art of Classical Greece. Have I got that right, Celeste? I'm talking to the...
Yeah,
almost
fine.
right.
Rodin, the Art of Ancient Greece.
The Art of Ancient Greece. I'm talking to Celeste Farge, who is one of the three curators who has worked very hard on putting this incredible exhibition together. And perhaps, Celeste, tell us a little bit about the origins of the exhibition. Why an exhibition on Rodin and ancient Greece?
Well, that's a very good question. We don't have any sculptures by Rodin in the collection, but we're very fortunate that this is a collaboration with the Musée Rodin in Paris. Mm-hmm. So most of the Rodin pieces come from their collection.
So the one we're looking at here, this very famous
that's right.
sculpture, The Kiss, is from Rodin Museum in Paris.
Absolutely, yes. And Rodin came to the British Museum in London for the first time in 1881. It was the first of many visits. Mm-hmm. He loved the museum. He would come here sometimes alone, sometimes with friends, to draw and gather inspiration. And he was particularly inspired by the Parthenon sculptures. They were designed by Phidias, who was known in antiquity to be the greatest artist of all time. And Rodin regarded Phidias to be his mentor. And we have paired the Kiss, perhaps rather bizarrely, with these two wonderful goddesses from the Parthenon pediment.
Yes.
And what is so interesting is that the heads no longer survive of these pieces, mm-hmm. But that was not something Rodin lamented, because he could read all the expression of these figures in their bodies. And they are so lifelike. They're cold, hard marble, conjured into warm, flowing drapery and yes. Warm flesh. Yes. They're so true to nature that they seem to live and breathe. And the same with Rodin's Kiss. You can't make out their facial features. The composition is such, when you walk around, you don't see their faces. But again, it's the expression in the bodies that matters for Rodin.
And that's why you've put these together.
Absolutely.
We are at the British Museum at the exhibition Rodin, the Art of Ancient Greece. I'm with Celeste Farge, one of the curators. Please ask us questions, ask Celeste questions, because she knows everything, and give us your comments in the comments box. We'd love to hear what you think. We are walking now to the sculpture that actually is the first image you see when you come into this room. Can you tell us why you chose this as the
well, it's such a wonderful sculpture. It's so modern, in a sense, because she is a portrait of a woman. In fact, she's meant to be Pallas Athena, the goddess of wisdom and the patron deity of sculptors, and also of the city of Athens itself. And she seems to be wearing the Parthenon on her head like a crown. Yes. But we view this very differently, perhaps, and we think that because Athena was born from the head of Zeus, perhaps she's giving birth to the Parthenon. Of course, the Parthenon mm-hmm. in Rodin's day was thought to be the summit of intellectual and artistic achievement. And again, this piece references Rodin's passion it's a lifelong passion that he has for the Parthenon and its sculptures.
And you do have in this exhibition a very comprehensive number of notebooks, sketchbooks.
Yes, absolutely. We have all the drawings he makes of the Parthenon sculptures, as well as photographs he collected and antiquities that reminded him of the sculptures. And these all became sort of part of a vast working archive for Rodin.
Tell us about this piece that we're looking at here. It was made when Rodin was quite young, wasn't it?
Well, not so young. He was 37 mm-hmm. And wasn't yet a well-known artist.
But not successful yet.
Not successful, absolutely not. He didn't go and train through the traditional routes. He failed the examination for the prestigious École des Beaux-Arts 3 times. And he would go to museums to study, and also the library. This piece here caused a huge controversy because it was so lifelike that he was accused of having cast it from life, so from his model.
And that was a bad thing at that time?
In the 19th century, absolutely. Nowadays, of course, when one thinks of Anthony Gormley, his sculptures, this was fine, but in the 19th century this was a serious allegation. We have paired this with a figure from the Parthenon frieze, because many scholars have wondered what Rodin's source could be for this piece. And we immediately thought of this one youth from the Parthenon frieze, because he has his hand raised to his head in a similar gesture. This figure, like the Age of Bronze, is also bristling with nervous energy. He's so alive. Here he is, his horse is rearing to go and he's longing to join the cavalcade, but his companions, which you see on the right, are not quite ready. They're being very slow and he's impatient and waiting to go. Rodin, of course, knew this piece very well. There are 2 drawings he makes of this frieze, so I think perhaps this was one of his influences for the Age of Bronze.
We have a question, Celeste, for you from Noël Latour, who sounds very French. What is Rodin's most controversial work and why?
Well, that's a very good question because there are so many pieces of his that are controversial. As I mentioned, the Age of Bronze was very much controversial in his day, but even later on in his life, when he was by then a very well-known sculptor, his Walking Man wasn't appreciated by all. They couldn't understand why Rodin would show a fragment, as it were, a piece, a work of art without a head and without arms. This was hugely controversial for the time.
Interesting. Tell us about this piece we're looking at here, where a head emerges from this sort of rough-hewn block.
Well, again, quite bizarre, and perhaps has many meanings. For those of you who know Camille Claudel, Rodin's lover, and also a very good sculptor, the head is modelled on her. But here she is, perhaps emerging, or she's submerged in this block of stone. And we think this references the ancient idea that sculptors had an intuition, and they could see the subject of their work within a block of stone, and they had the power to release the subject. And so Rodin, like Phidias, had this intuition.
I'm Rosalind Salkis. I'm at the British Museum with Celeste Fage. We're looking at the exhibition Rodin, the Art of Ancient Greece. We've actually please ask us questions, send comments. Celeste knows everything and will answer eloquently. We stopped to look at a photograph of the Parthenon as it would have been in Rodin's time, which is very interesting. And Celeste, you told me something fascinating earlier, which is that Rodin did not believe in any sort of restoration work. He thought that the Parthenon should be kind of left to crumble.
Absolutely. And in fact, there was an earthquake in Rodin's day, and that left structural damage to the temple. And Rodin wrote an article advising against any restoration. He thought a building was like a human body, and that it flourished, it came into being and should be allowed to decay. Rodin never went to Greece. He never saw the Parthenon, but he had a passion for Greece. And in a way, he invented his own myth of Greece.
Yes. And we're standing now, we've walked into a section that has possibly the most famous Rodin image, the thinker. And what's really interesting here, one of the things that's really interesting is that there are 2 sizes that we can see. And the one on the right is the size it would have been, wouldn't it?
That's right. That's the original size. The thinker, of course, originated on the gates of hell, which was Rodin's life project, as it were. They were gates for a new decorative arts museum. In fact, the museum was never built, but Rodin took many of the figures from the gates and brought them down, as it were, and transformed them from architectural ornament into art object, rather like the Parthenon sculptures. And many of Rodin's most famous pieces, The Kiss, for example, originated on the gates of hell. And the thinker has had various identities. First it was Minos, judge of the underworld, and then Dante himself, and even Rodin. And there's a large-scale cast of the thinker in bronze on Rodin's grave in Meudon in Paris. And Rodin, a hallmark of his work is to enlarge objects, to make them monumental.
Yes.
And then they transcend various meanings. We're very interested in the gesture of the thinker because he has his chin resting on the back of his hand. And of course, in ancient Greek art, this is a gesture of mourning. So perhaps rather than a thinker, he's a man who is mourning.
In mourning. Well, we have a question here which is really very relevant to the thinker and to these other very famous images, which is from Kersti Drott. What would Rodin think of the many reproductions of his work that can be seen throughout the world?
I think he would very much have approved. I mean, he was a great businessman, particularly later on in his life, and made many replicas of his work. Rodin didn't sculpt in marble or cast in bronze himself. He had a team of assistants to help him. Later on in his life, he had as many as 50 studio assistants. Rodin would model in clay. This was a very versatile material, and you could work very quickly sketching out your ideas and add and take away. Of course, marble and bronze were very expensive materials, and it was only if he received a commission that it would then be carved in marble or cast in bronze.
And in fact, the model of the thinker, the big thinker that we saw over there, is in plaster, isn't it?
It is, yes, and this is the version that Rodin kept by him all throughout his life, which is the same with the Kiss, which is why we've chosen these pieces in particular.
We have another question from Colin Henson. Some of the sculpture seems unfinished. Was this deliberate?
Absolutely, and this is what made Rodin so radical in his day. In the 19th century, objects had to be finished, they had to be perfect, they had to be beautiful. Rodin wasn't interested in this. He loved just to show a torso, for example, and I think he was getting inspiration, of course, from ancient sculptures, which were very often just fragments.
Yes. In fact, this one that we're looking at here, the Death of Athens, has that quality that you talked about earlier of emerging from the stone. Is this also part of that idea of things being not entirely smooth and beautiful and finished?
Absolutely. This treatment of the sculpture is very much a hallmark of Rodin's work. He has some areas beautifully polished to a very smooth surface, and other areas he likes to leave rough hewn. And you can see all the tool marks in his sculptures as well, and he would often leave his thumbprints in, or imprints of fabric.
Yes.
For Rodin, this was very interesting. For others, it was too radical. Rodin was way ahead of his time in this respect.
I'm Rosalind Sulkis. I'm with Celeste Fage at the British Museum. We're looking at a wonderful exhibition, Rodin, the Art of Ancient Greece. Please ask us questions, or ask Celeste questions, and leave your comments. We want to know what you think too. We are sort of midway through the exhibition, perhaps. We're trying to show you as much as possible, looking at another pairing. You've paired many of the Rodin sculptures and the Parthenon sculptures or friezes for various reasons that you've been telling us about. Well, tell us about this one here that we're looking at, where we have the martyr and then we have another
we have a figure here, yes, from it's one of the metopes on the Parthenon, and we see this is the battle between the centaurs and the lapis, and this youth here, the life is ebbing away from him, and he lies prostrate. And Rodin must have been thinking of this piece when he made his sculpture of the martyr, which we have displayed alongside. And again, here Rodin, this figure originally came from the gates of hell, but Rodin takes her off, enlarges her, and it becomes an independent work of art in its own right. And here we see a very lifeless figure. Rodin then constantly reinvents his figures, and later on in the exhibition you can see a sculpture where he takes this one very figure, turns it the other way up, adds wings, and it becomes a figure in flight, which he calls Icarus's sister.
Yes. I think we have another question. From Martine Aaron, are all of these Rodin sculptures part of the permanent collection of the British Museum and always on display?
The Rodin sculptures,
yes.
Most of them come from the Musée Rodin in Paris. We're very fortunate. This exhibition is a collaboration with them. There are just a very few exceptions, such as the Burghers of Calais, which hopefully we'll see later on, which come just from down the road from Westminster, in fact.
Because that's Westminster, the parliamentary
outside
buildings
the
have...
of Parliament, yes.
Wonderful.
That's right.
And another question from Laurence Thompson Bisset. Celeste, would you consider Rodin the last classicist or Renaissance sculptor as well as a radical modernist? His work seems to be as much reminiscent of the Capitoline Gaul or the Charitier at Delphi, and obviously the Gates of Hell reference Gilberti's doors of the Florentine baptistry.
Well, you can't put Rodin into a box. You can't classify him, really. And he really blurs the boundaries between the past and the present, and in fact sometimes sees in the past the future.
Yes. And in fact, here we are looking at his love for the past, at his love for antiquities, because we're in the room of his collection of ancient sculptures, aren't we?
That's right, yes. Rodin began to amass a huge collection. In fact, he's got more than 6,000 works of antiquity, mainly Greek and Roman, but also Egyptian, Assyrian, Chinese and Japanese.
Where did he collect these?
Primarily from dealers in Paris.
And in fact, he had so many that he created a museum, didn't he, in Meudon, which I believe you told me earlier is still open,
yes,
and the public can see.
Absolutely.
Wonderful.
I recommend a visit. It's quite fantastic.
Another question for you from Lee Evans. Did Rodin ever use other art disciplines, and did he work with a blueprint to create his torsi?
Well, we think of Rodin as a sculptor, but he was also a very accomplished draftsman and even painter. We have focused mainly on sculptures for this exhibition,
yes.
but in the Musée Rodin you can see many examples of his other work.
And the question about a blueprint to create the torsi, I suppose that's a reference to the kind of issues about live casting or using live models or so on that we talked about earlier. Did he draw just from knowledge of the human anatomy? Sculpt from his own knowledge of the human anatomy? Did he use models?
He used models, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
He very much was influenced by nature, so he would always have a model, a human model, and later on models would come to his studio, and he didn't want them to pose in classical poses.
Mm-hmm.
He would ask them just to walk around naturally the studio, and he could observe their movements.
Yes. We've moved into the final room here, which has the great Burghers of Calais sculpture or grouping. And these, I think, on the right are some of the individual figures, aren't they?
That's right, and this sort of goes back to the question we had previously. Rodin would always begin by studying the naked figure, and once he had understood the anatomy and the human body, only then did he then clothe his sculptures. Mm-hmm. Of course, Rodin being such a radical, he then even produces works without the head and hands, and the piece in plaster is very important. He exhibits this right at the entrance of a major retrospective exhibition that he has in 1900 in Paris, and this stands as a manifesto for a new kind of sculpture.
I'm Rosalind Sulkis. I'm with Celeste Fage at the British Museum. We are in the final room. You're watching a live stream from London. We're in the final room of the exhibition of Rodin, The Art of Ancient Greece, here at the museum. Really wonderful exhibition that shows the relationship between much of Rodin's work and the classical sculpture that he was so fascinated by. And Celeste, one of the three curators on the exhibition, has been talking to us about these various aspects of Rodin's work. And we're moving towards what is, I suppose, a sort of climactic image of the exhibition, which is the Burghers of Calais. And it has quite a sort of an interesting history. Can you tell us a little about it, Celeste?
It certainly does. I mean, I think these are one of Rodin's masterpieces. The Burghers of Calais, they were 6 prominent citizens of the city, and they had offered to sacrifice their lives for the sake of their fellow citizens during the 100 Years' War, so the war between the French and the English. And you see here the men with the rope shackles around their neck. They're barefoot and they're wearing their undergarments, and they're walking through the marketplace of Calais to bring the keys of the city to the English king. And each of them is coming to terms, or not perhaps, with his imminent death. Mm-hmm. And it's an extraordinary study in the psychological state of mind of these figures. It's intensely moving, I think.
Indeed. And there are several of these, aren't there? You mentioned that this one comes from Westminster down the road.
Just down the road.
How many of those sort of large-scale groupings exist around the world?
There are 12 of them. This one we chose because of the English connection. Mm-hmm. It was purchased by the Art Collections Fund in 1911, and Rodin came over to London to discuss where it should be placed and also for the unveiling. And
on that note, we will leave things. Celeste, thank you very much for giving us such a wonderful tour of this exhibition, Rodin, The Art of Ancient Greece, which opened here at the British Museum in London last week and is running through July 29th, so plenty of time to visit if you can. Thank you.